her master's degree, where she received, that's okay. She received her undergraduate and her graduate degree. And she came to our lab as a geographer, a physical geographer who specialized in soil erosion. And so Ligia brings a knowledge base that has been very complementary to most of the projects in the lab, that has been really expanding for all of us, I think. She is the lead author or a co-author already on a number of papers. I think there's 6 papers that are in the peer-reviewed press. And she's received multiple awards and honors, most of them in the form of grants. So she, I think most interestingly, she received the Wilford Gardner International Union of Soil Scientists Congress Fellowship funding in 2018. Here at KU, she received the Ida Hyde Scholarship for Women in Science. And she used those funds to do something super interesting. She went to Arizona in the summer, and I forget if it was it must have been 2019. She, because not a lot happened in 2020 in that respect, but she went to Arizona to take a class on global carbon cycling modeling, which has also expanded Ligia's education, but also ours. And most recently, the Soil Science Society of America named her as a recipient of the Encompass Scholarship, which is a leadership honor that gives Ligia some funding, but maybe even more importantly than funding, it gives her the opportunity for professional networking opportunities. So Ligia is quite accomplished, and she enjoys thinking the most about the interactions of soil structure and soil chemistry and how roots and microbes influence those processes. And working on the NSF EPSCoR project, she's had the opportunity to work across the precipitation gradient here in Kansas. And I think that's what she's going to be sharing with us today. So without any more further ado, I will turn it over to Ligia. Thanks, Ligia.
Wow, thank you, Sharon. I should always have you read my CV. That was awesome. I was like, is that person me? Apparently it is. So that's cool. So today, yes, I want to talk about a part of my dissertation that is not about enzymes, which is kind of sad for me, but it is something that I also love, which is soil structure. We'll be talking a lot today. So anyways, I can't see any of you, so if I do anything wrong, just shout and let me know. But today I'm going to be talking about carbon depth distributions and how land use and climate mediate their depth distributions and some of the mechanisms of protection behind that. So, and why is that? So, because soils are the greatest carbon reservoir in the planet, there's a lot of interest to understand its role as either carbon sink or source and the associated carbon stocks with it. But as land use changes, so does the associated carbon stocks. So like in this paper from 2002, the authors looked at land use change across the globe, and they found that sometimes that change had positive effects on that carbon stocks, and sometimes it had a negative effect. And today I want to focus on the transformation of lands into crops. As we can see here highlighted in blue, both transformations into crop have had a negative effect in the carbon stocks in the soils. So, and for the clearing of forests into crops, the authors found here represented in this right-hand plot, the depth was an important predictor to understand the changes in carbon stocks, but not significantly at depths greater than 60 centimeters. And when changing pastures to crops, the authors found that one of the variables that explained well the change in carbon stocks here was rainfall amounts, as we can see in the bottom right graph here, that all rainfall amounts negatively changed that carbon stock. But what are the mechanisms that might be behind that? So one of these mechanisms is related to soil structure. So like in this paper from 2000, the authors developed a conceptual model that explains differences in macro aggregate turnover and how it affects the capacity of soils to protect and retain that carbon for longer periods of time. But even these trends have been observed before the conception of this model, as we can see here, data from this 1995 paper that shows that macro aggregates in prairie sites had a greater proportion of intramacro aggregate POM, so particulate organic matter, than restored and ag fields. And that's because when fresh residue is incorporated into macro aggregates, it will then decompose and form these coarse and fine IPON that will later be the source for new micro aggregates within these macro aggregates. But not only that, but land use change also changes rooting depth distributions. So if we think about native lands with deep rooting systems, when we change that into crops, we change also the rooting depth distribution associated with it. And like this figure from 2013 shows, this loss of roots has major implications for subsoils because deep roots play important functions such as water uptake and weathering. And not only that, roots also promote soil porosity, soil aggregation, and enhances carbon sequestration. And these are important in shaping soil structure as well. And because both soil structure and rooting depth distributions are ecosystem features that help govern that SOC depth distribution, we can use this parameterization of SOC with depth to understand carbon vulnerability to land cover change and management practices, which was what the authors from this 2020 paper did. So they parameterized carbon depth distributions across the continental US, and they used some of these parameters to understand carbon dynamics in different ecosystems. So here we have carbon at surface, and if we focus on grassland systems, those that have not been plowed, so here by the described by the absence of a horizon that has been plowed, represented in blue, we see that these grasslands not plowed, that have not been plowed, have a greater capacity to have carbon at surface. And not only that, but the authors also looked at the carbon stocks of soils. And again, focusing on grasslands, we see that there's a greater carbon stock, associated carbon stock in these grasslands that have not been plowed. So with that in mind, we asked the question, so how does land use change affect soil organic carbon depth distribution in grassland soils across a climatic gradient? So for that, we sampled two land uses, native and agriculture, across the state of Kansas, because we see that Kansas has this really nice climatic gradient from west to east. And we sampled native sites represented by the green dots here, and we sampled agricultural sites represented by the orange triangles across the state. And the samples that we took were for 5 depth intervals, and we created composite samples that we use for analysis. But for 3 different precipitation totals, we also sampled by genetic horizon, which we use to run more extensive analysis. So using the carbon data from these sites, we actually can parameterize a carbon function. So this function here is an exponential nonlinear decay function that can estimate the rate at which carbon is distributed across depth. So the function works by estimating carbon using carbon at the lowest depth, carbon at the surface, and depth based on this rate beta. And beta is the rate of SOC decay with depth. So this paper from 2006 illustrates really well what beta means. So when we have carbon concentrated closer to the surface, we have a larger value of beta. But as carbon becomes more well distributed with depth, we have a lower value of beta. So if we think about that for our sites across Kansas, in native prairie sites, what we expect is that where precipitation is lower, there's not enough water to pump that carbon down. So we expect carbon to be concentrated closer to the surface. But as we move towards wetter sites, so as we move from west to east, we expect that carbon to be more well distributed with depth. So what we expect is a decrease in beta as we move from the west to the east, more wetter sites in Kansas. But for agricultural sites, because we lost so much SOC at the surface, we don't expect to be much of a difference across depth when whatever the rainfall amount is. So we actually expect a similar value of beta across the precipitation gradient. So if we plot that beta across the precipitation gradient, what we actually expect is that native betas will show a negative slope. And we expect that agricultural betas will show a slope closer to 0. So how does beta behave across the precipitation gradient? So here we have our hypothesis, and this is what we see in the data. So it's pretty much what we expected that it was going to happen. So native betas do seem to change significantly across the precipitation gradient, and agricultural betas do not. change significantly, as this right-hand graph of a preliminary analysis shows. So, but what are the mechanisms that might be behind the change in beta across this climatic gradient? So here I have this plot of fraction of total roots per centimeter of soil. And what that means is that for each centimeter of soil, for each depth increment, the total roots that we saw for that profile. And what we see here is that with greater precipitation, we also have a greater proportion of roots in these systems. But when we impose agriculture in these systems, we seem to alter the natural relationships of these rooting systems very deeply. So if we think about this, but only for coarse roots, so here in this right-hand graph, I'm showing the proportion of coarse roots for the whole soil profile. And what that means is that for every part of the soil that had coarse roots for the entirety of the soil. And what we see is that there's an increase in that proportion of coarse roots as precipitation increases, and the rate at which it increases is significantly different than what we see under agricultural sites. And keeping that in mind, we have to think that as roots perforate soils, they also have the capacity to change soil porosity. So in this right-hand graph here, I'm showing porosity across the precipitation gradient in two metrics. So total porosity represented by the triangles facing upward, and effective porosity is the triangles facing downward. And what we see is that there's a strong evidence that there's an increase in total porosity in native sites with precipitation, and there's a decrease in the effective porosity in agricultural sites as precipitation increases. We hypothesize that this is related to changes in root abundances in these systems. But not only that, these changes in root abundances also change the carbon inputs below ground, not only because of the actual root biomass, which is comprised of almost 50% carbon, but because there's a change in the rate at which exudates are liberated. So like in this graph here, we see EOC, so the extractable organic carbon that we're using as a proxy for root exudates across the precipitation gradient. And the colors are the same, so orange for agriculture and green for native. But here I divided the surface soils, so soils above 75 centimeters are represented by dots, and deep soils are represented by squares here, so depths greater than 75 centimeters. And what we see is that there's strong evidence that there's more EOC being released as surface in native sites as precipitation increases. And not only that, it's in a way that significantly differs from what we observe in agricultural sites. So to sum up, what we see is that there's a significant increase in EOC towards wetter sites at surface under native prairie. So in these changes in carbon inputs are related also to the shrink-swell capacity of the soils. So we can see that by using modern carbon, which is a metric from radiocarbon analysis, to understand that. So in this plot here, we see that there's more modern carbon at surface for native sites represented by the dots, which is expected because of greater productivity of these systems. But with depth, we see that there's more modern carbon under agriculture. And we hypothesize that there's greater shrink-swell capacity at surface under agriculture than native prairie, which allows its superficial, more recent carbon to flow downward in the profile. And as precipitation increases, the rate at which this newer carbon can be pumped down is enhanced, as we can see here that the diamonds that represent agriculture in this second precipitation total here shows a greater proportion of modern carbon deep in the soil in comparison to the native sites here as the blue dots. And this also happens in the wetter site. So overall, greater precipitation seems to translate into a greater proportion of superficial, more modern carbon flowing downward in general. As we can see that both the navy dots here and triangles have a greater proportion of modern carbon than the other in general. And this seems to be related to the shrink-swell capacity at surface. So because that's what's going to allow that carbon to really flow downward. But that doesn't mean that that's not important at depth, because if we didn't have that shrink-swell capacity just as much at depth, that would mean that it would pool at some at a certain depth. And what we see is not that. So using the coefficient of linear extensibility here, Cole, as a proxy to understand the changes in shrink-swell capacity, what we see is that there's a significant change in that shrink-swell capacity under native and agricultural sites across the precipitation gradient for deep soils. So this is deeper than 75 centimeters. And not only that, but there's a strong evidence that the rate at which that happens is significantly different. And what that means is that this changes the capacity of that modern carbon to be pumped down in the soil as rainfall amount increases, which the preliminary shows in this right-hand graph shows. So there's more modern carbon. There's a strong evidence that there's more modern carbon being pumped down in these agricultural soils than in native soils across the precipitation gradient. So, and this might be related with the faster turnover time that we talked about of macro aggregates, or putting in another way, greater loss of macro aggregates under agriculture, as this 2000 paper suggests. So in surface soils, while we don't see a lot of change in the micro aggregates, so again, above 75 centimeters, we don't see a change in the micro aggregate proportion of these soils. We do see a change in the macro aggregates between 0.21 and 4.76 millimeters, which I'll just call intermediate macro aggregates to make this easier. And we see that there's a negative relationship in the formation of this intermediate macro aggregates under native, a process that contrasts with that observed in agriculture. But that's because there's an increase in the proportion of macro aggregates larger than 4.76 millimeters. So these really large macro aggregates, which is a trend, again, that differs from that we observed under ag. So if we think that this decrease in the intermediate macro aggregates is at least partially due to the fact that larger macro aggregates that we saw, so the greater than 4.76 millimeters, so that larger macro aggregates can form under native systems and trap carbon for longer periods of time, that increase in EOC at surface that we saw a couple of slides back can actually flow downward and increase the propensity at which carbon can form these intermediate macro aggregates at depth, as we can see here in this graph. So this graph shows the macro aggregate abundance of this intermediate macro aggregates per gram of soil organic carbon. And what we see is that carbon seems to have a greater capacity to influence aggregate formation deep in these soils, a trend that we do not see under agricultural sites, and could help explain why the differences imposed by land use change seem to reverberate deeper in the soil. So I talked a lot, and what are the takeaways I want you to get from this? So first, the precipitation mediates the depth distribution of SOC. So where water is limiting, SOC is concentrated on surface layers, but where water is sufficient, SOC is more well distributed vertically. So changes in infiltration rates help carrying carbon deeper in the soil and thus lowering beta. I also want you to take away from this that changes in rooting depth distribution with land use conversion affects carbon inputs to deeper soil layers in ways relatively unexplored, such as by changes in root exudates. Moreover, changes in the shrink-swell capacity under land conversion also affect the rate at which carbon flows downward. And the disruption of macro aggregate formation at surface in agricultural soils affects the carbon propensity to form aggregates in deep soils, because carbon is not retained at surface in the same capacity in native as it is in native soils. So with that, I want to thank my lab, the Billings Lab. I also want to thank the Hermes Lab at UCR for the help with the analysis. The MAPS team, thank you so much. It's such a big effort, so many labs, and I'm very honored that I get to work with all of you. KBS, thank you for the support as well, in the University of Kansas Field Station, and the funding sources that allowed me to work on this and present this. And with that, I will gladly take any questions. You don't have to have questions, but I'm happy to take them if you have. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Ligia. So I'll stop the recording here.